Welcome to the Awen podcast. I'm your host, Bill Baxter. This podcast is devoted to Frank Lloyd Wright, his work, his ideas, and the world he set out to make more beautiful. Each episode features conversations with those who know his work well. We'll explore Wright's vision of what he called organic architecture, a union of nature and structure. Wright often stood apart from his contemporaries, pushing back against Victorian and classical traditions in favor of something more grounded in nature. That idea, the unity of nature and structure, sits at the core of his work. In each episode, we'll explore the influences behind that vision, from Japanese design to the broader cultural forces that shaped his thinking, and why it still matters today. Welcome aboard. Well, our guest today, ladies and gentlemen, is Richard Cleary, an art historian, an architectural historian, someone with very strong roots here in Wisconsin, which is where this podcast issues, Madison to be exact, which is Richard's hometown. And it was good to see him in the spring, to listen to him talk about this book, this wonderful book, this beautifully illustrated book called The Bogk House, A Bold Experiment. All right, this home in Milwaukee that had gotten rather short shrift prior to this book. And Richard has co-authored the book with Anthony Ellefson, another University of Texas professor. Richard is emeritus from the University of Texas. Prior to that, at Carnegie Mellon University, where he published a book called Merchant Prince and Master Builder. E.J. Kaufman being the Merchant Prince, and of course the Master Builder, Frank Lloyd Wright. A long-standing interest in Frank Lloyd Wright, certainly, Professor Cleary. How did you think about Frank Lloyd Wright, sir, before this project?
Well, I'm happy to be with you today, Bill. And it's always fun to be thinking about, things in Madison and Wisconsin. Wright is always intriguing, to speak about at the same time. I think that for me, my interest in Wright is, well, first of all, interested in Wright and his clients. So that book that you mentioned about Merchant Prince and Master Builder, it was a story about the Kaufman family and Frank Lloyd Wright trying to reimagine Pittsburgh as well as build falling water. And I'm interested in motivations. As an architectural historian, what I really care about is, why do people do what they do? Why do clients choose architects? What are they thinking about? What are architects thinking about? And so this is always an interesting topic for me on Wright. Why do people come to Wright? What does he see in them? What do they see in him? And another aspect of Wright that's interesting me on the part of why does Wright do what he does, or how does he do things, is how does he think about actually making buildings? What are they made of? What are his interests? And so my thinking about Wright prior to Anthony Ellefson giving me the phone call about, hey, do you want to do a book together? I had been more thinking about Wright in the post-World War II years, the Usonian era. I've been really interested in Wright and the different kinds of building technologies he had been exploring. And that was where my head had been. I hadn't worked so much at all. And Wright in that period between the wars, particularly not in the decade of the teens, although I'm interested in it. So the idea of, what was Wright doing? What were the motivations of his clients? Was Wright make things? They were just all, things I was always fascinated to get a chance to dig into. And this opportunity to write the book with my dear friend and colleague, Anthony Olofsson, gave me the chance to look at Wright in a different phase of his life than I really knew well, and to engage in a different set of clients, and also to do something that was based in Wisconsin, where I was living at the time.
Oh, yes. Okay. So, right in the teens, in the 1910s, let's set a chronological table here that will give listeners a chance to place the Bogk House in time and what Wright was doing at that time and how it was considered, or is considered, I should say, among scholars today as being transitional, a period in his career where a number of different streams are appearing. But what are the buildings that we should associate with the Bogk House as far as time is concerned?
Well, that's a great question, and to situate the Bogk House in the teens. Now, the Bogk House, will get that nailed down first. It was designed in 1916, and it was occupied, by the clients by the beginning of 1918. So that's just at the time the United States was getting involved on the ground in World War I. Now, for Frank Lloyd Wright, the context, as you mentioned, is this period of the teens that are sometimes called the lost years, which was the subject of a book by Anthony Olofsson back in the early 1990s. And the teens, were a time when your listeners may recall that in 1909, Frank Lloyd Wright left his family in Oak Park, went to Europe with his, beloved Mae McChaney, and he made a just major break in his career. He, in a sense, hit a midlife crisis, both personally and professionally. So Wright comes back from Europe in 1910, 1911, and his personal life is scandalous in the eyes of many people who might be potential clients or willing to fund potential clients. His professional life had to be rebooted because he had shut down his office and when he left for Europe. And so the period of the teens is a huge personal and professional rebooting of Wright's life and career. The major work that is an anchor for Wright during this time would be Taliesin, which you know so well, Bill. And we are talking in this case about Taliesin 1, which Wright began shortly after his return from Europe. And then we have the horrific events of 1914, the fire and murders there, which caused Wright to have to rebuild not only his personal home, but his personal life without this new love that he had. So it's a second kind of rebuilding. Beside Taliesin in Wisconsin, I think the major works that want to associate with the Bogk House era are Midway Gardens, which sadly no longer exists. But Midway Gardens was built in the south side of Chicago, not too far from the University of Chicago, around 1913, and was this major sort of beer garden concert venue in the city that Wright designed and built very quickly by 1913, and was a field for experimentation for him. As we get a little bit closer to the time of the Bogk House, 1915, 1916, for listeners in Wisconsin, the AD German Warehouse
Yes,
project in Richland Center, that was beginning to take form, and that would go full bore construction about the time the Bogk House was finishing up. Larger for Wright in terms of commissions, the kind of gold ring that he hoped to resuscitate his reputation on an international basis was the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, which was a commission that was kind of dangling in front of him that he was chasing after from about 1913 on. And it finally becomes, completely live in 1917, would occupy him until 1921. And then on the tail end of all this are the early projects of Awen Barnsdall for the Barnsdall House, the Hollyhock House in California.
Oh, yes.
And the complex that was never fully realized of a theater and other houses on the grounds where the Barnsdall House, the Hollyhock House, is today. So just to run down that list again, Taliesin in Wisconsin, still there,
Yes.
version 3. Midway Gardens in Chicago, no longer there, demolished.
1929, I believe that was.
Yeah, it was a victim of the Depression and Prohibition. Both things were whammies for its fortunes. And then we have the AD German Warehouse as kind of a Wisconsin marker. It's not so well known outside the state. And the Imperial Hotel, which truly became a major work for Wright. And then later on, we'll say the Barnsdall House as the beginning of Wright's work in California.
Now, placing that in time brings us into some things that you have expanded upon quite a bit in this book, and that is Wright's so-called primitivism. Can we talk about that?
Yes. I should say, at the outset that, the idea of associating Frank Lloyd Wright with primitivism as a concept and the way it shapes out in this book, comes from work that Anthony Lofson, had done back in even the late 1980s, and it forms a key part of his book, The Lost Years, that came out, I think, in 1992, something that Anthony had been thinking about, obviously now for decades and decades. And the idea of Wright and primitivism in a kind of a nutshell is that Wright, like many artists of the sort of turn of the 20th century era, and artists like and architects like his own mentor, Louis Sullivan, at the earlier end of that, believed that Western architecture, Western art, many parts of Western culture had kind of gone off the tracks in what we today, I think, would you say, being authentic culture, something that's true to who people are. And one move to try to recover this is for many artists like Wright, was to look back to what they imagined to have been a time of, we could call it a golden age, or a time in earlier civilizations where art and culture were totally in sync. So there was this idea out there, not unique to Wright, shared by many others, that a task for an artist or a task for an architect is somehow to reconnect to that which had been lost. which is okay to say as initial concept, but like, well, what is that? And how do you connect? And there will be many different ways of trying to reestablish a connection to this lost past. For Wright, there were a couple of aspects that were really important to him. He believed that certain cultures, and one culture that he greatly admired, as is well known, are the cultures of Japan. But he also believed that there were other ancient cultures in ancient Egypt, ancient cultures of Mesopotamia, pre-Columbian cultures in the Americas, China in Asia, Oceania as well. That these cultures, besides as part of their being in sync of art and culture, they were also in sync with the natural world. That was a real key, that they were connected to the natural world in a certain way. But the connection was not simply about replicating, making realistic depictions of the natural world. It was being able to understand generative principles of how the natural world operate. And for Wright, one of those operational elements was geometry, finding that the source of design, of ultimate design, is back in geometry. But then you can always mess around with geometry. We can rotate squares, we can spin circles and triangles, and that can be really good and interesting, and you can make great art out of that with no more attachment. But Wright believed that the world of geometry, the work of geometry, was to make a translation from the, let's say, the complexity of the natural world as we experience it and seeing it, to get down to its essential elements that can be reduced to geometry. In a way, if you want to think about art, I think about Cézanne, the great French painter who, looked at landscapes and houses, and he kind of broke them down into these sort of fundamental building blocks, almost that way. And Wright, in his way, is looking for a way to use geometry as a key to make a connection.
May we say a universal language?
Yeah, that was Wright's belief, that not simply that each culture ancient culture was going off in a completely different direction, but that there was, in this kind of golden age era, there was a fundamental connection, a sort of universal vibe, if you will. And the evidence for that, for Wright and other artists, it would be seen in sort of recurring motifs that across different cultures. For instance, in ornament, things like a square that's manipulated to be recessed with other squares, a square that can rotate into different patterns. We can see these sorts of moves in ornament across many cultures over the world, over great swaths of time. So Wright believed that there was something out there that is universal, that could speak to our deepest beings as humans. Because the other part of this for Wright, this discovery of this connection and a means to represent this connection, is ultimately to touch us as human beings, somehow to enrich our lives. It's a really romantic kind of way of thinking.
This is someone who's got something quite ambitious going on here, to a philosophy of architecture, if you will.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Totally. And he had a good mentor to even think about architecture in these terms, because you remember that Frank Lloyd Wright was Louis Sullivan's kind of prime assistant for a number of years in Chicago. And we can imagine Sullivan who had his own complex theories of transcendent ornament in architecture, explaining these ideas to the then young, Frank Lloyd Wright. And this is something that Wright would run with in his own way in his own professional career.
Primitivism. You mentioned in your lecture some weeks ago here in Madison that Wright was always on the lookout, I'm paraphrasing you, to do something extraordinary. Tell us about that.
Well, I think, Wright, saw himself, as an artist in the fullest sense, or, and architects can be artists in this way, that he's not simply trying to solve problems out there in the world. And you can do wonderful architecture and be kind of very rooted to the here and now of solving tangible problems in the built environment. Wright was somebody who had a personality that required him to constantly innovate, constantly explore in different directions, and at the same time as solving the practical problems of making a building that works for someone. I think we see Wright in this kind of sense of experimentation. Even if you go back to or especially if you go back to the early years of the Prairie School, the breakthrough of opening, of spatial exploration, material exploration in the prairie houses, for example, at the same time that he's doing explorations in the commercial building, like the Larkin building, with a great interior space, expressive sculpture at the entrance, constantly going back and forth. He's an artist who, I think, pushes ideas, gets restless, pushes on, and moves really quickly when he does.
Uh-huh. Now, the Bogk House, researching the Bogk House, if you try to dig down on the nature of its architecture, we hear things like Prairie School, we hear his primitivism that we just discussed, arts and crafts. Some have said that the Bogk House is a master class in arts and crafts. There's a lot going on here, and I'd like to spend some time talking not only about what Wright was doing there, but about the Bogks themselves and what they wanted in this home.
There is so much to unpack there. And, the three things that you just mentioned, Bill, are all going on in this house. The Bogk House, for Wright, was a canvas in which he could test his expression of some of these ideas of primitivism, push his interest in exploration of new ornamental forms in architecture, and see where that went. At the same time, the Bogk House, when you look at its basic plan, its overall organization, it is reassuring that it has origins in Wright's earlier work of the first part of the 1900s, certain layout moves that he would make and laying out houses at that time are part of what he does in the Bogk House. How it's actually built in many ways follows the building technology choices he was making in the first part of the 1900s. And then at the same time, the spirit of the arts and crafts movement and Wright's aspect of it, where you celebrate the properties of materials, you look for systems of handling those materials that celebrate these properties. You think about the continuity of materials, of how all the pieces blend together, which can be very much part of the arts and crafts spirit. This is all woven, through the house as well.
Now, having said that about arts and crafts, how do we deal with poured concrete here? That doesn't seem like it's in keeping with traditional materials.
Well, you're right that poured concrete is not a traditional building material, particularly as a finish material. But Wright's view of materials is not limited to a set kit of materials. Wright always does, he likes brick. He likes stone to a certain, in its, as we know, say, a Taliesin or falling water. He loves glass as a material, and certainly celebrates wood as a expressive, finish material. Traditional plasters, Wright uses, but Wright is also, and this comes back to your question about his experimentation. Wright was fascinated with emerging material technologies and looking for ways to make them architectural. And this concrete for him, was a really intriguing material that, was of interest to him, certainly before even, the time of building Unity Temple in Oak Park, which is a poured concrete, building. He was intrigued by concrete on a number of levels. One was, besides its value as a structural material, concrete is a material that can be anything we want it to be. You can cast it in any number of shapes or forms. It, unlike a brick, does not inherently dictate what it wants to be, as architects sometimes say about materials. And for Wright, this is a great challenge. Like, how do you take a material like concrete, which is in a liquid form at some point in the construction process, and how do you control that? What is its nature? What is the nature of its expression? How do you make it true to itself? This was a hard question for Wright. At the Bogk House, we see it explored in two areas. One is we see concrete as a sort of straight up structural material. It's a poured concrete basement
Yes.
in the house. And nothing unusual about that. It was new to be doing poured concrete basements in Milwaukee at that time for houses, but not unheard of. And Wright's other area at the Bogk House, where it feeds into like, what do you do to make concrete expressive and architectural, was casting concrete as part of his ornamental, process.
Oh, yes.
And The sculpture, the Bogk House has a great frieze under the cornice on the front facade that we may talk about a little bit later. But this frieze is cast concrete, the figures. Also in the Bogk House, all the sort of horizontal trim type moldings that you see in the house, they too are concrete, given a very specific finish, very beautiful work. And the former owners, the Elsners, did an amazing job, keeping that up to snuff in its form. But Wright is using concrete in a way that was not so much seen in 1916 in a house, using it as a material for what we could say the ornamental program of the house.
Now, do we see him departing from arts and crafts here to what he called the art and craft of the machine? That there's something about industrialism that is attractive to Wright and repugnant to more orthodox arts and crafts people.
Well, yeah, it's a complicated story about the relationship of what do you do with machines in the arts and crafts world. If we move back certainly to the late 19th century, when the arts and crafts movement is founded by people like William Morris in England and then carried over, a good portion of that was a hard push against industrialization and the machine displacing the dignity of human work. Wright's take on this, and Wright was not alone in this aspect, is that the problem was like, how do you use machines? A machine itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, but machines can be used, creatively. But you have to work with machines to do things that machines do best. And for Wright especially, you don't use machines to make things that look like they were made by hand here. So for Wright, in the turn of the 20th century, in his Prairie School architecture, you see like in his joinery, how he handles corners in his moldings, or the joinery of how connections are made in the furniture. They are made so that they kind of follow the means of production of how the wood was cut and milled by machines. Wright was interested in brief in looking for ways to put the machine at the service of the creative artist and creative artisan. And that's the case at the Bogk House too. So the same thing would apply to concrete. What do you do? What can we do with it to be creative, as opposed to letting it sort of replicate things mindlessly for us?
And so we have an architect who philosophically is in a very, very creative period. He's inclined very strongly to Japan. His primitivism and monumentalism is in evidence here. But what does all that mean to Frederick and Catherine Bogk?
Yeah, that's something that ultimately we so far don't have a definitive explanation. Unfortunately, the Bogks did not leave us, as far as we know, with any really clear statements about what the house truly meant to them. We see indirectly they liked the house. They stayed in the house from the time they built it until the end of their lifetimes. They kept the furnishings intact, for the house. They did not do any major changes. The Bogk's daughter told the late Barbara Elsner at one point, that they loved the house. So we know that they deeply cared for this house. It meant much more than a real estate invention or a simple place to live. It was something that was important to them. What they fully understood of the house with respect to Wright's understanding of what he was trying to do with the house is a really unknown thing. They certainly, the Bogks and Wright, landed in a comfort zone, with each other. Wright certainly had his own agenda that he's bringing to the house. The Bogks' agenda for us is a little harder to get to, but we have some, interesting, clues looking at the evidence indirectly. One is, Frederick Bogk was a self-made man. Both he and his wife, Catherine, were second-generation German immigrants in Milwaukee. And they had come from each fairly modest backgrounds. Bogk's family, came out of a world of being a butcher by trade, and also in the common practice of, many German butchers expanded into saloons and taverns as a way of developing other sources of income. Bogk comes out of this fairly modest, circumstances, and doesn't have education beyond high school, but begins to make his way in real estate at first, fire insurance, closely related to real estate. He had a certain degree of charisma that made him an attractive candidate for local political office, and he became an alderman in Milwaukee, which didn't pay hardly anything. You had to keep your day job with that, but it brought prestige, and it also gave him opportunities to make a mark, if you will, on the city of Milwaukee. And he was a serious alderman for over 16 years in his life. We see. Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Well, I was wondering about the Bogks, that it seems that they have arrived.
Yeah, they have arrived. They achieved a degree of material comfort, a degree of social prestige, and enough. They weren't at the upper echelons of Milwaukee society, but because in particular Frederick Bogk's position as an alderman, he was comfortable moving among the elite members of society, such as the Pabst family, for instance. We know a little bit less about Catherine's friends and associations at this point in their life for me to be able to elaborate on that. They had arrived, but this is the interesting thing about the Bogks. You look at their trajectory. They've come from fairly modest means. They've worked their way up, and they had along the way commissioned a nice country cottage on Oconomowoc Lake from Eschweiler, one of the leading Milwaukee architects. But then when they make a decision in 1915 to buy a lot and to build their own house, the expected thing would be stay within the community, stay with one of the respected, very, very good architects in the, say, German-American community in Milwaukee, and build like the other houses in the North Point area. But they don't go that route. They go with an architect who had really not led any buildings with his own constant direct involvement. There were no custom Wright buildings in Milwaukee. The Burnham block and the American system built homes were kind of a special case. So Wright has no track record as a custom house designer in Milwaukee, nor does he have a practice base in Milwaukee. Wright's out Taliesin and he's in Chicago. Those are his two practice bases. Wright is this guy, as we mentioned at the outset of our conversation, in a difficult situation. He has this complex personal life, which many people regarded as scandalous. You wouldn't touch him, for that. And then from a business point of view, Wright is in constant financial trouble. He is not a good financial risk. And Bogk prided himself on being a very sensible, fiscally minded businessman and public leader as an alderman. They make this jump to this architect who somehow offered them something that they felt they really needed and wanted. And so they took an unusual route, took a risk. Would Wright be able to actually build this house anywhere close to a budget that they could afford? Those are unknowns, but they jumped. They did it, and they had to get a second mortgage to get it through. But they they managed, and they stayed with the house. They actually stayed with Wright. Wright would show up uninvited with friends for dinner. And that's a fairly common anecdote.
Yes, he did that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, he was known for that. The Bogks stayed on good acquaintances with their contractor, who was a associate of Wright from Taliesin, and then became a Milwaukee building inspector after building the Bogk House. They stayed on close ties with the project architect, who also Bar Williamson. They stayed on close ties with him. Williamson and Wright never spoke again after the time of the Bogk House era. They had a major meltdown that was never reconciled. The Bogks kept this whole little world going. It's pretty fascinating.
Is there a connection between Catherine Bogk, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Asian art?
Yep, and I think we have to throw in Frederick Bogk's interests as a wild card in the story. Apparently, one thing we know as a fact that before Catherine married Frederick, she worked as a clerk, saleswoman in a Milwaukee art decoration store. Asian art was popular with people from the middle classes to far wealthier people, collecting objets d'art, collecting Japanese prints or Chinese paintings, other things. So there was a lively trade in Italia, if you will, across the United States in the teens. And Catherine may have developed an interest of that during her time as a shop person in an art store. We don't know about Frederick's taste in art, but we keep seeing sort of possible connections with people who also had an interest in Japanese and Asian art. One was George Mann Niedecken, who would be brought into the picture by Wright and the Bogks to handle the interior furnishings of the Bogk House. And Niedecken was an interior designer based in Milwaukee, who was known as also being a person extremely knowledgeable about Japanese art, and there seems to be a point of commonality. We have a clue. In 1921, Milwaukee Journal, I think it was, or the Sentinel, published a story about the popularity of collecting Japanese prints in Milwaukee. It had to do with a show at the forerunner to the Milwaukee Art Museum. And it was, the article was commenting about this phenomenon of collecting Japanese prints and Japanese objects, decorative objects. And it mentions in this, among the foremost collectors in Milwaukee, George Van Niedecken, Frederick Bogk, and this could just be the male, chauvinist thing of the time. No mention of Catherine in that phrase. And, of course, our boy Frank Lloyd Wright, who truly was a great connoisseur and a dealer in Japanese prints and other aspects of Japanese decorative arts objects and objects from China as well. So something is going on in that mix where there's an affinity around themes. And put this in, you have to have these infinities that came to the commission. It's possible to imagine how the Bogks might have been receptive, to Wright's, talk about his ideas on the primitivism, connecting to maybe universal themes of design. Certainly, Wright being very comfortable with whatever taste the Bogks had in Japanese art. I wish so much, we had a fly or something on the wall, for the time when the Bogks and Wright first sit down with a set of drawings, for the ideas of the Bogk House. What was that conversation like? Certainly talked about very pragmatic things in that conversation. We know that because the Bogks were good, strong clients. They pushed back on certain things that they felt Wright was not giving them in the practical design of the house.
Well, it seems they did, and our friend here, George Van Niedecken, was a very active intermediary in that whole process.
Yeah, totally.
And softening Wright's severity, if you will, for the Bogks, or helping to do such a thing.
Yes. Niedecken, when I was a student, Bill, back in at Wisconsin in the late 60s and early 70s at UW, when we talked about Frank Lloyd Wright, there wasn't so much talk about George Van Niedecken. And I had kind of grown up in the world where, you think of Frank Lloyd Wright making his houses, shaking them out of his sleeve, as Wright was fond of saying. And, Wright certainly cultivated the myth of the master architect, totally in control of everything going on. And he downplayed the contributions from others in his practice or associated with building a building. And, those of us who are older kind of grew up on that myth that's very hard, to shake, to suddenly realize, Wright couldn't do all this by himself in the first place. And he needed more than just mechanical hands, to draw out his, whatever he shook out of his sleeve. Wright relied on expertise to make his buildings. And George Van Niedecken was very important to Wright's practice from about the mid, say 1905, 1906, going forward, crossing over the time when Wright goes off to Europe. Niedecken's role on projects like the Roby House, for example, And it was to help Wright kind of completely fill out whatever the program of furnishings, might be. And what Niedecken could do for Wright was that Niedecken, after say 1904, had his own company. He could make furniture, for Wright according to Wright's designs. He could execute, with the people on the ground, various craftsmen, windows and things like that for Wright's work. But as you just said, Bill, in the case of the Bogk House, Niedecken could also modify and act as an intermediary between things that Wright was proposing and that a client was not entirely comfortable with, and could tweak Wright's work to make it fit better in the eyes of the clients. And Niedecken would also contribute work of his own design in the spirit of Wright's broader objectives, for the house. And at the Bogk House, we see, all three roles. Niedecken served as the direct, conduit for getting things like the initial rugs made. He executed Wright's designs.
Oh, those
faithfully.
Fantastic rugs.
Yeah.
My goodness.
Niedecken modified some things that, as you mentioned, that the Bogks seemed to resist. The Bogk's daughter, Dorothy, had told Barbara Elsner many decades back that her mother, Catherine Bogk, felt that Wright's furniture designs were too severe. And as a correction to that, Niedecken adjusted the trim around the horizontal surfaces of the dining table and other kind of horizontal furnishing elements in the house, adding a series of ebony squares, inlaid ebony, that break up the starkness, if you will, of those horizontal lines, alternating the black walnut of the material of the furniture with the very black ebony. The late Barbara Elsner, interestingly, she told me she didn't care for Niedecken's alterations. She much preferred Wright's stronger lines as a matter of personal taste. But so it's a question of taste there. And then Niedecken also provided his own designs for pieces that for furnishing the house that Wright was not involved with.
Well, Wright seemed to be very confident in Niedecken's work, and at one point, I think you say in the book that Wright essentially signed off on the project, leaving it to Niedecken.
Yes, Wright. Whether Wright said, "Oh, everything is good, and you guys take over. I'm confident in this," or as a matter of kind of default, Wright was distracted by other ventures, that other venture in particular being the Imperial Hotel, because midway through construction on the Bogk House, at the time, things were really heating up with interiors. Wright and his son John, they left for Tokyo to set up the office that will produce the drawings for the Imperial Hotel on site. Wright was gone 4 months, and we don't know what degree Wright stayed in communication with the work back in Milwaukee. What seems to be happened was that the work in Milwaukee was being superintended on the architect's behalf by Williamson, and Russell Barr Williamson, who was young at that point, capable of being a project architect, and Niedecken, who was much more experienced as an interior designer. And they were, of course, working closely with the Bogks. According to the Bogk's daughter in an interview with Barbara Elsner, Frederick Bogk was leaving a lot of the decisions about the interior details to Catherine. So some of her views are coming through there and are being translated into form by Niedecken.
So this being the case, taken together, these things contribute to what is an incredible home with very, very tangible ambient warmth. It is, and I think it has been said by the Elsner children that they did so love simply congregating in various parts of the house, that it was so welcoming to them.
Yes, this is such a good point you raise, Bill. The house for Wright, is this very bold experiment in terms of these questions of architectural expression, especially in ornament that we just alluded to earlier. But at the same time, he made a house for the Bogks, and then it was eventually there was a short intermediate owner after the Bogks had passed, before the Elsners acquired the house in the 50s and raised all their kids there. They made a house that is extraordinarily comfortable. It's warm, it's inviting, it offers all kinds of opportunities to delight the eye. The lighting, maybe it's fortuitous that the Bogks chose the site they did, but the house has wonderful daylight coming on, good southern exposure, nice western exposure, then a more closed northern exposure. And so there's light that kind of wraps through the windows around the house during the course of the day. Light does interesting things going through the art glass windows. It also does interesting things, casting shadows through the windows down the steps from the ground floor up to the bedroom floor. And then the textures that Wright employed in the house, the interior of the house, like the exterior of the house that we see, is a very elegant brick. In classic Frank Lloyd Wright form, very deep horizontal cuts in the way the mortar is laid, so it stresses the horizontality. Very, very textural kind of brick. And then that's contrasted inside and outside the house with the kind of ornamental pieces of cast concrete moldings, which have a very, very smooth finish. And it's a house that you just want to touch. And the Elsner children, told me, they love literally climbing the walls because you could kind of get your fingers into them, and one of the Elsner children was a dancer and really liked this. There are also these nooks and crannies where it made for fabulous hiding of things.
He's so well known for that.
Yeah, Easter egg hunts and things like that.
Yes.
So it's a place of delight. Warm colors, soft textures of the carpets, mysterious as they are with their patterns, and then the shifting daylight. And then at night, Wright was extraordinarily good at handling indirect artificial lighting in the house for an ambient kind of light. And so when the sun is down, the house takes on its own kind of special, very different warm qualities from the recessed lighting that was part of the original design.
Oh my goodness, yes. And we've been putting off the freeze for a while now, but I'd like to talk about that frieze. It is so incredible, and especially at night. The name of Antonin Raymond comes up here as being the one who probably designed those figures.
Well, he probably, we believe that he made a rendering of these figures. The day-to-day process, exactly who said what to whom, when Wright's staff at Taliesin was drawing the Bogk House, there's no record of those conversations. It's very, very hard to identify whose hand is on what drawing. But what you're speaking of, Bill, is there's this incredible rendering that was made for the sculptural frieze on the front of the Bogk House, underneath the eaves, that is in just elegantly, superbly made of using different kinds of paint materials and other drawing materials, super highly skilled rendering. There were some things on this drawing in the lettering. There's also a strange notation that happens to be in the metric system, which Wright's office wasn't using, that make us, suggest that this architect named Antonin Raymond was the person assigned to make this rendering. We asked, Raymond was a Czech architect, trained as both an architect and artist in Prague, and he had come to the United States. He had worked with Cass Gilbert in New York City before coming out to Taliesin with his wife for a time just as the Bogk House was being designed. We were shared this drawing that I was referring to is in the Library of Congress. Anybody can look it up, under Library of Congress, Bogk House, and you can see it for yourself and blow it up. It's spectacular. And of the people who were at hand to be able to draw that, Raymond is like suspect number one. And then these other clues of where we see bits of handwriting, the use of metric, and we shared that with a Raymond scholar who's really good at his drawing style, and it seems consistent, with Antonin Raymond. So by default, as being, this artist type architect, highly skilled, trusted by Wright, we think he's the renderer. Wright didn't do these kinds of renderings. And so that's why we listed that. Now, what the kind of conversation would be as preliminaries are being made.
Very well. But as far as the frieze is concerned, it's absolutely stunning and illuminated. Driving by there at night, it must be just a feast for the eyes.
Well, it's a funny thing about that drive-by at night, because what kind of makes the effect is the lighting that's in the attic that's behind, and that's just basic attic lights, ultimately. I don't think that Wright designed intentional lighting for the way we'd see that frieze. But if you get there before sunset, when the sun is low, and hitting that frieze directly in the evening, and is glinting, also reflecting off the art glass windows that are just below the frieze. It is a wonderful sight there. Yeah, late afternoon, early evening, good time to to see this frieze. What is this frieze? In brief, the frieze has a very intriguing group of figures. What we see there on the frieze, today, is a row of 4 winged figures that seem to be wearing, headdresses, and
yes.
they remind, people of aspects of Maya art,
Yes.
Pre-Columbian Central American art. They can possibly, if you just focus on the headdress, you can imagine certain kinds of like Hopi in Native American, cultures, the headdresses that they have. But at the same time, they aren't literal. You can't really go and say, oh, Wright is representing a certain pre-Columbian culture for us, or he's not representing a certain, North, American native culture for us. He is, in his words, conventionalizing, trying to get back to some essence of form that he believed was universal, as you said earlier, in common, with these ancient cultures. And if you look at the rendering that we were discussing, you'll see in the rendering that there was a suggestion that there were to be 2 other smaller figures that were not executed on this frieze. And they appear to be men wearing a kimono. They seem to suggest, something related to Japan there. But again, not a literal representation of a specific figure in, say, Japanese art, but a conventionalization, an abstraction of certain themes that we could associate with Japanese culture. We believe that, this frieze was ultimately, in a way, a kind of a monument to Wright's theories of this primitivism, of trying to get back and make a connection to this, golden age where, fundamental forms were connected deeply to culture.
Oh,
The tragedy, tragedy for Wright, though, the tragedy is that people at this time in America, that link had been broken. It's very hard to look at those things and to feel what Wright felt we should be feeling about them, because our ties have been so severed by our own particular civilization. And that's why Wright, once you get late in the teens, early 20s, is going to move on, from this mode of exploration, and then move towards other forms of architectural ornament, the patterns on the concrete block and so forth of the California houses. And so that's why, it's almost a kind of a bittersweet thing. You look at the Bogk House, these elements that, sort of represent something Wright cared deeply about at the time, pushed it, eventually realizes that this is not going to work. It's not a line that's going to go forward. And Wright moves on to something else.
And he's involved in the Imperial Hotel very strongly.
He's totally involved, and the Imperial Hotel becomes an even grander canvas for him to work out these ideas at this, point. From Bogk House as part of almost a feverish moment, if you will, from 1916 going to just about 1920, where Wright is putting these ideas out. The Bogk House, the Imperial Hotel, the early product designs for the Barnstall properties in Los Angeles. But that moment was going to, what would end for him.
Yes, indeed. And the transition, yes. Richard, it's been an education today. I want to thank you for being with us, for enlightening us. A word for listeners. Folks, you need to buy this book. Okay, The Bogk House, A Bold Experiment. It is wondrous. A feast for the eyes. Analysis is superb, and an education in a part of Wright's career that hadn't been so well known prior to this. And so thank you and Anthony for the contribution you've made to our knowledge about Frank Lloyd Wright and enjoyment. And Richard, I wish you the best.
Same to you, Bill. Good luck with this podcast. It's a wonderful thing to launch.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thanks for listening. Join us next time as we continue exploring the ideas and legacy of Frank Lloyd Wright, an architect who believed the world could be made more beautiful through a design grounded in nature. He often reminded his apprentices to rely on nature because it would never let them down. That idea remains central to understanding his work. As always, the views expressed here are those of the host and guests. See you next time.